Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and talk about plants today. I was going to do assignment 6.05, but it's not too difficult. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a little research. Just make sure you put in your citations. That's kind of the main issue I've been seeing with that assignment. All right, so I want to talk about plants because there's a lot on your EOC in terms of plants. So let's start out with the basics. There's what we call non-vascular plants and then vascular plants. So vascular plants are kind of your typical plants. You know, they have leaves, they have stems, they have roots. They can be plants with flowers. Okay, those kind of things. Just normally when you think of a plant, those are going to be your vascular plants. And of course, they have vascular tissue, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then our non-vascular plants are pretty much everything else. It doesn't have all those parts. They're not advanced. They don't have vascular tissue. They can't grow up high. So they're going to be close to the ground. These are like your mosses and things like that. All right, so we're going to concentrate on the different parts of a plant today. A lot of these you know, so I'm going to concentrate on the ones that you might not know and the ones that your EOC is definitely going to touch on when you take it. So leaves, obviously the main function of the leaves absorb sunlight for photosynthesis, but the leaves also have tiny little holes on them called stoma or stomata. And so these are for gas exchange. So they take in the carbon dioxide, they give off the oxygen. Um, there's little guard cells around the hole that open and close this hole. So that's how it functions. And then depending on where the plant is, um, it might open or close at different times, depending on, you know, how, it might dry out a little bit more depending on what kind of climate it in. So when I say it dries out, because not only is it for gas exchange, but water is going to come out of those holes as well. There's a term for it. It's called transpiration. So water basically goes in the roots, and then when those holes are open, it basically causes it to just basically suck up inside and into the leaves, and then right back out in the form of a gas, unless we close those holes off. But of course, if you close the holes off, you can't take carbon dioxide, you can't do photosynthesis. So it kind of balances when to open and when to close it. All right, roots, pretty self-explanatory. Their support, they absorb water and nutrients. Roots also have little root hairs, which the whole point of root hairs is it just helps it be really efficient at absorbing water. So it's going to have a super high surface area. Stems, not too much to talk about here. Support leaves, support flowers, stores water. Cactus is basically like a giant stem. And then the needles are modified leaves. So they don't really have leaves. So the stem has basically been modified to do photosynthesis. And then the leaves, there's no leaves. They've just been adapted to have those needles. Okay, next thing are the different tissue types in a plant. So starting with the outside and then working our way in. We have your dermal tissue. Sometimes it's just called epidermis, just like you. It's your skin. It's the very outside of the plant. It's used for protection. Not only is it used for protection, it can secrete the bark of trees. It can secrete the waxy cuticle of a leaf. So that's just it's just like a wax coating that some leaves have that help prevent it from drying out. And then the next layer in, so this is kind of the middle, not the very, very center, but the next layer in is your ground tissue. And this is support, and then this is storage. And then the very center, where a lot of the plants get their name, is vascular tissue. So remember, we're talking we have vascular and then non-vascular plants. So the reason they're vascular plants is because this allows them to grow up taller because they have two different tubes in the plant for transportation. So you have the xylem, which transports minerals and water up the plant, and then the phloem, which transports glucose or sugar or photosynthetic materials, whatever you want to call it, down the plant. Okay? And then on top of that, you also have the meristematic tissue, which includes the cambium. And this is basically new growth of the plant. So these tend to be like on the ends, and they can turn into any tissue type it needs to, almost like human stem cells. All right, so that's the end of that one. I'm gonna see if I can back out and go to flowers here. Get that one done too. Okay. All right. So before we get into flowers, now last time we talked about vascular and non-vascular plants. So now we're just talking about vascular plants. There's two types. There's more than two, but the two main types we're going to talk about. The primary type we're going to talk about um, with flowers is what we call angiosperm. So that's just a fancy way of saying a group of plants that uses flowers and fruit for reproduction. So the seeds are going to be enclosed in some sort of fruit. So the whole point of flowers is reproduction. That's it. If you get any sort of question on flowers, um, in terms of the function, it's reproduction. Okay. And then ultimately, the ovary of the flower will get turned into a fruit. And then inside the fruit, of course, those are the seeds. And then these are some examples. So pretty much any type of flower you see, um, it's going to turn into some sort of fruit. Doesn't mean it's something edible, but it will turn into some sort of fruit. So for example, these are blueberries. The one right here would be bananas. All right. And then there's also, we can further classify them as either monocots or dicots. It's just another way to classify them. Again, you will be asked about this on your EOC, at least on your EOC. And there's a question on one of your assignments coming up too about classifying them. But anyways, for your EOC, just remember one of them. You don't have to memorize both. Just remember some traits from one of them, because if it doesn't belong to that category, it's going to be the other. So the ones I put on the left here are the easier ones to remember. That's why I put those. So floral parts of three, that's just the number of petals. So monocots are either going to have 3 petals or 6 petals or 9 petals. And then the veins are going to be parallel, so kind of up and down. And then dicot, they're not in sets of 3. Okay, so this could be like 5 petals or 7 petals. And then they're going to have branching or net-like veins. All right, moving on to the different parts of a flower. You'll definitely be asked about this on your exam in your EOC. So let's start with the male parts, the stamen, hence the name men, is going to be the outside part. So these little things right here, those are the stamen. Okay, there's 2 parts to the stamen. There is the anther, which are these top parts right here. This is where pollen's going to be. And then there is the filament, which just kind of holds it up. All right. And then the female parts are the pistil. That's the entire middle part is going to be all the female structures. So you have the stigma here. The stigma is a little sticky. Stigma, sticky. One way to remember, and the reason it's sticky is so, if an insect lands, a bee or whatever, gets pollen on them, goes to another flower, and then lands over here, it's going to stick here and then work its way down. And then that's how pollination occurs. So you've got the stigma, the style is just the tube that connects it to the ovary, and then the ovary, you have, your ovules, the egg, all that stuff. Basically, this, once it gets fertilized, once it gets pollinated and fertilized, this is going to mature. This becomes the fruit of the plant and will contain seeds inside of it. All right. And then I had mentioned pollen before. Pollen is basically it's basically plant sperm. It allows plants to reproduce without water. Um, something that non-vascular plants don't have. And then of course inside the fruit you have your seed. A seed stores the embryo. Embryo basically baby plant. And then this is going to develop when conditions are right. It's not, you don't just, put it in dirt, give it sunlight, give it water and it grows. I mean, that works for some, but every seed is different. There's a tree in Florida that has to be burned before it can actually start to sprout, which actually makes sense because if you're in this very, very dense forest, you're on the bottom of this dense forest, there is no sunlight. So after a forest fire, there'll be sunlight and they'll be able to grow. So, you know, something to consider. All right, and then that leaves us to the last group, which we call gymnosperms. Um, Basically, gymnosperms, these are your plants, your trees that are going to have cones for reproduction. So they don't use flowers, they use cones. Okay, so there are going to be male cones and then there are going to be female cones. Pretty simple. The male cones are going to have the pollen, and then the female cones are going to have the egg. Now, they have different methods. Oftentimes, it's just the wind that gets the pollen from the male cone to the female cone. But really, that's about all you need to know for them. I wouldn't worry too much about it. All right, so that's everything on plants. There's a little bit more detail in your lesson about some of the different types of plants. You'll be asked some of that on your test, but what I went over kind of concentrates on what's on your EOC. So just kind of keep that in mind. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording here. If you guys have any questions, let me know.